Good afternoon again, ladies and gentlemen. If I could kindly ask you to move towards your seats for what will be the final time this afternoon. It's always a pleasure to reach the culminating discussion of the day at our FPI Forum. Will be a wonderful conversation, I'm sure, between Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster and our fellow and the director of our Center on Military and Diplomatic History, Mark Moyar. Before we get started, and if you'll forgive me taking the moment, I want to use a quick opportunity to say thank you to a few members of the FPI team before we wrap up and when folks are headed towards the exits, but in particular, Elaine Stern, Lindsay Markle, our excellent government relations team at FPI. Very little of what happens would happen if it were not for them. And Danielle Barrow was our operations director. And the three of them in particular have done much of the great work that has made today happen. Very grateful to the three of them. And of course, I'm very grateful to Mark for everything that he's done, standing up CMDH really since July of this year. So it's a new effort. Mark arrived at FPI in the summer of 2015, that after he came to us from Joint Special Operations University. Prior to that, he'd been an instructor at Marine Corps University. The frequency with which he's publishing books is really quite stunning, that he has a forthcoming history of special operations forces coming out next year, and in the end of 2018 he'll have a sequel to his very well-known and truly excellent book, Triumph Forsaken, the Vietnam War 1954 to 1965. All of us at FPI are fortunate to have Mark on the team, and greatly look forward to the conversation that he'll be having today with General McMaster. Thank you both.
Great. And thanks, Chris, to you for all your hard work that's gone into this event. I'm Dr. Mark Moyar, the director of our newly formed Center for Military and Diplomatic History, and we've heard a bit today about some of the reasons why we actually need a center like this. There's problems on both the supply side and the demand side. So on the supply side, military and diplomatic history are really out of fashion at civilian universities, which is why you have someone like a Ben Sass, or there's actually a lot of other PhD historians here who are not teaching at universities where they would, under normal circumstances, be teaching. And then on the demand side, there is, I think, a deficit of knowledge about history here in the policy world, and also to some extent a lack of interest. So we're trying to redress both of those problems. Now, social scientists, political scientists, will often tell you that historians don't know how to do anything except tell stories, which is about as silly as saying Fidel Castro doesn't do anything except for provide health to the needy. But I am going to start with the story because it is a very effective way of getting people's attention. And after a day of being bombarded with speeches and us being the last place, I thought it would hopefully help us provide a point of departure. So 8 years ago, in this same town, there was a lot of talk about a new idea called smart power, if you remember that. And one of the key elements of smart power was using non-military means to alleviate conflict. And it was said that under the Bush administration, there had been this over-reliance on the military instrument of power. So we are going to now use the non-military instruments of power because these problems have root causes that are non-military nature, things like human rights violation, poverty. And so we're going to have these whole-of-government approaches where we have the civilian agencies taking on more of the work, and the military is going to be doing less. And in theory, it sounded pretty appealing in a number of respects. We then saw this put into practice in a number of places, and I'll just talk about one example, Afghanistan. So the Obama administration decided to increase the development aid in Afghanistan from 1.2 to $4.1 billion. They undertook a civilian surge, which went about 500 civilians in Afghanistan to 1,300 civilians. And they set about trying to actually implement this sort of smart power approach in Afghanistan. And unfortunately, the results did not live up to the billing. And some of you here, I think, saw this firsthand. But for one thing, we saw the State Department, the USAID could not get their experienced people to go to these countries, so they had to bring in contractors and temporary employees. And the vast majority of those people never actually got out into the countryside because it was dangerous there, and the civilian unions didn't feel they were obliged to go there. We then did not have oversight of where these huge amounts of cash were going, and they oftentimes ended up in the hands of the enemy or corrupt officials, and so that you were actually exacerbating conflict rather than alleviating it. And you also had the problem that if you wanted to do aid projects, the Taliban were there, and they were actually going to kill your aid workers. They were going to kill your governors. And so we actually saw that there was counterinsurgency gains, but it really didn't have much to do with smart power, and it had everything to do with military power, because it was basically where the U.S. military went into those areas, brought the Afghan government officials with them. And I would argue that this huge waste of resources could have been avoided if we had actually paid some attention to history, if the Obama administration had looked back. And they didn't have to look back far, because you could go back to the Clinton administration to actually find some of these same ideas. So if you think Colombia in the 1990s, we heard a lot of the same ideas. We were going to use non-military power. We weren't going to give money to Colombia's military. We were going to give it to civilian agencies, to law enforcement. We were going to do crop substitution programs. But what happened, same things that happened in Afghanistan. So it was too insecure to go into these areas, people getting killed, and ultimately it wasn't until the governments in both countries decided to put a heavy emphasis on the security side that you actually made progress. So I think this is just one example where there's some pretty clear indications from history that a different policy should be reviewed. Now history is oftentimes not so straightforward. What we often see is a situation where there are multiple precedents you could look for. A classic case would be Iraq in 2003. After we took down Saddam Hussein, we looked to ideas for rebuilding the country. So we focused very heavily on Germany, Nazi Germany. The de-Baathification was borrowed from denazification. And I would argue in hindsight, we actually probably should have looked at some other cases. Why not look at Japan in 1945, or say the Reconstruction in the American South after the Civil War? We actually could have learned a lot from there. So history is not going to necessarily fall into your lap, and it requires a lot of serious thought. I would add that we can't just ignore it, even though it's difficult, because the times we've actually tried to do foreign policy without any history at all has led to disaster, because it's based on unfounded assumptions. But we do need to be aware that history is going to be used, and so the question is, how do we use it effectively? History, I think, is also important because it gives us familiarization, it gives us context, so that if you're confronting a counter-narcotic situation, for example, it would be useful if you'd actually spent time studying 5 or 10 actual historical cases, because then when you go to the next one, you'll at least know what questions you're going to ask. You can have an idea of what solutions might actually work. Now, our center is doing events, a variety of events, to try to bring historians from around the country here to interact with the policy community. And we're doing it in a number of venues. We're doing some public events, this being the largest one we've done so far, some that are specifically targeted at private government audiences. So we're going to the Pentagon, Capitol Hill, Foggy Bottom, places like that. And we don't expect that we're going to fundamentally change U.S. foreign policy doing this, but we do think there is a lot of value to getting historians and the best historians to talk to people who are making decisions today. And we think also that by sort of beating the drum on history, that we will get people in the national security community to spend more time looking at history, to think historically. You don't have to have a PhD in history to think historically. We are fortunate today to have somebody who I think is perhaps the best possible person to convey this message. Sitting next to me, Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster, who has a PhD in history and is at the same time an incredibly distinguished practitioner. He first came to public attention during the Gulf War in 1991 when he commanded an armored cavalry company at the Battle of 73 Easting, in which he routed a much larger Iraqi tank force, and this became sort of a textbook study in new forms of armored warfare. 1997, he published a book that was based on his PhD dissertation called Dereliction of Duty, which immediately became mandatory reading across the armed services. In 2004, he was the commander of U.S. forces at Tal Afar in Iraq, where he was able to achieve success against insurgents at a time where very few Americans were actually succeeding in that regard. He spent time in Afghanistan. 2010, took charge of the International Coalition Anti-Corruption Task Force. And he's now at the Army Capabilities Integration Center, where he is in charge of planning Army capabilities for future conflict as we go forward. And he's done a lot of other great things, but in the interest of time, I'll leave it at that summary. But I'd like to turn it over to Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster.
Thanks. Thank you so much, Mark. And what a privilege it is to be with all of you. How many history majors here? Just want to know how many. Okay, so I mean, there's still some people to convert, maybe. You know, I thought maybe it was, it was going to be an audience of fellow historians, all of whom are talking about how underappreciated we are. But I think this is such a great idea. I mean, the idea of the Center for Military and Diplomatic History, for all the reasons that Mark identified. So, what I thought I might do is talk about how I think the center can really help us, make us better. Better at defending our nation in particular, better at anticipating the demands of national security, and then crafting a national security strategy to address really threats that we see that are growing, threats that are growing to our nation and I think all civilized peoples today. So I'll try to be super brief here, because what I'd really like to do is see where you want to take the discussion and hear your ideas and thoughts as well. But this is important, right? This is an important center. And from our perspective in the Army and the joint force in our military, because thinking clearly about diplomacy and national security is fundamental. It's fundamental not only to protecting our vital interests and preventing armed conflict, but also ensuring that our military is prepared to respond to threats to national and international security, and to be able to, as Mark alluded to already, to resolve crises at the lowest possible cost. In lives and blood and treasure. So, but thinking about future war is often neglected, or it's just done superficially. I mean, remember the orthodoxy of the revolution in military affairs in the 1990s? I know a lot of you are probably too young for that, but in the 1990s, I mean, it became conventional wisdom, right? The future war was going to be great. It was going to be fast, cheap, efficient, waged from standoff distances. We'd be able to wage war like the George Costanza approach to war. We were just going to leave on a high note after doing some really cool military stuff. So it didn't acknowledge war's enduring political nature, the fact that people fight for the same reasons Thucydides identified 2,500 years ago: fear, honor, and interest. It didn't acknowledge war's interactive nature and therefore the inherent uncertainty of war. Remember the hubristic language, dominant battle space knowledge. There was this. You can find it on the internet. It has its own Wikipedia page now. But if you type in shock and awe, right, it's a 1996 paper, and just read the 4 conditions we were going to be able to achieve in future war. And one of them was just like total control of everything, And so it didn't even acknowledge any kind of agency or control over the future course of events by one's enemies or adversaries. And then certainly it didn't acknowledge war as a contest of wills, right? And our ability to prevail strategically in peace and in war in particular depends on, as you just heard from the senator, knowing who we are, right? And knowing our values. So some, particularly in academia, don't want to study war, as Mark alluded to, in part because they confuse the study of war with advocacy of it. And what we ought to do is think about thinking about war and conflict in the way that Raymond Bradbury thought about his purpose for writing Fahrenheit 451. Okay, so when he finished writing this dystopian novel, he was interviewed, and the interviewer said to him, "Well, are you trying to predict the future?" And he said, "Hell no, I'm trying to prevent it." And so unless we can think clearly about future war, we'll be unable to deter conflict. But others neglect, as I mentioned, continuities in the nature of war and focus almost exclusively on social or technological changes in the character of armed conflict. But paradoxically, it's the neglect of diplomatic and military history that perpetuates deficiencies in understanding, which in turn then can make war more likely. So what is lacking sorely lacking today, I believe, is depth of understanding. Right? We achieve new heights of superficiality a lot of times, in our discussion of what's going on in the world and what we might do about it. In recent years, many of the difficulties encountered in strategic decision making, in operational planning, and in force development have stemmed from shallow or flawed thinking, enabled in large measure by the abject neglect of history. And so I think this center will help policymakers and civilian and military leaders overcome both the tyranny of the daily crisis, right? Because when you're thinking and reading about history, you're actually freeing your mind from the day-to-day chores and engaging a subject more deeply. But I also think it'll help serve as a corrective to a tendency toward wishful thinking that makes the future appear much easier, and fundamentally different from the past. So what the Center for Military and Diplomatic History will help us do is to go beyond what we should think about particular issues, but I think that with a huge contribution is going to be helping us understand better how to think. And so what can the center do in particular in terms of how to think about problems? And I think that first of all, it'll help us understand better how to do as Clausewitz suggested we do. To take what seems fused, big problems, and then break them down into their constituent elements, right? To engage problems we're dealing with now, right? Daesh, for example, or ISIS, or transnational terrorist organizations, or this terrorist proto-state in the greater Middle East, and engage it on its own terms, and recognize the complexity of these problem sets. Also, just how to ask the right questions. Asking first-order questions. Sometimes we kind of skip that stage, We go right into, well, what should we do about this? Well, let's do a little bombing. Let's do a little this or that, right? And we confuse activity with progress because we don't properly frame the problem. What is the nature or character of this conflict? What is driving the conflict? Who are our enemies and adversaries? What are their goals? What are their strategy? What is their strategy? Sometimes we skip right into what's the enemy organization, how are they disposed, and how do we go after them, for example. How to understand historical events and circumstances on their own terms. How to trace events back to their causes. How to apply an interdisciplinary approach to the problems of diplomacy and war that includes anthropology, literature, philosophy, economics, and science. History is, I think, inherently interdisciplinary. And then, as Mark mentioned, how to think in time, consistent with the historian Carl Becker's observation that the memory of the past and anticipation of the future should go hand in hand in a friendly way, without disputing over priority and leadership. So whenever somebody talks to you about like the deep future or leap ahead capabilities, just run for the exits, right? Because something crazy is coming right after that, And I think what we really need is are grounded projections into the near future, a focus on solving real problems, addressing real threats, real adversaries in real geographic areas. And we learn that militaries, countries that are prepared to either prevent or respond to crisis are those who think clearly about the problem of future war in that grounded way, who think about the future as the ancient Greeks said we ought to think about it, right? Think of ourselves as walking backward into it, paying attention to what's going on today and what's gone on in the past as a way to think about the future. So without the depth of understanding that history provides, that the center will help provide, we'll remain vulnerable to what we've got to always quote Clausewitz whenever we can, what the 19th century philosopher of war, Karl von Clausewitz, warned against, the tendency to regard war as something autonomous rather than an instrument of policy, misunderstanding the kind of war in which we're embarking and trying to turn it into something that is alien to war's very nature. In short, this center and the history that the center promotes is important because I think it can provide a strong antidote to future folly. So this is why historians, I think, have to make a special effort and I think be unabashed about connecting historical knowledge and understanding to contemporary strategic and operational problems. Now, we have to be humble about that, right? Historians should be particularly humble about that and duly qualify any analysis or historical analogies. But we must not hesitate to help, I think, military officers, civilian officials use history to help think about concrete, contemporary, or emerging problems. So applying history to understanding the problems of today and tomorrow is just as important for citizens, though, as it is for diplomats and defense officials. So I'm glad this is more of a public forum here, and I think that the center reaching out to our citizens is going to be particularly important because citizens have to possess a fundamental understanding of war and of warriors if they are to remain connected to those who fight in their name, and if they are to hold our governments, right, our governments accountable for decisions involving killing and the prospect of death. And if society is disconnected from an understanding of war or is disconnected from that society's warriors, it will become increasingly difficult to maintain just the fundamental requirements of military effectiveness or to recruit young men and women into military service. So the connection between our military and our society is something that we might focus on as well as necessary to preserve the warrior ethos that permits servicemen and women to see themselves as part of a community that sustains itself through sacred trust and a covenant that binds them to one another and binds them to the society that they serve. Absent a fundamental understanding of war and what it takes to fight it, popular culture cheapens and coarsens the warrior ethos. It further separates warriors, often portrayed as flawed, fragile, or traumatized human beings, from their fellow citizens. So while the humility of the historian and the historian's sensitivity to the limits of reasoning by historical analogy are important to preserve, historians must engage on contemporary issues. So this conference, the work of this center, is important because unless we access history in a purposeful way, its lessons will, as the great historian Carl Becker warned, lay inert in unread books. So I'm really looking forward to seeing where you'd like to take the conversation. What a privilege it is to be with you. Thanks.
Great. Well, thank you, HR, for those terrific remarks. It's brought a few more points to my mind. You talked about taking the time to free your mind, and that's kind of one of the things we're trying to do is to just get in with a senior person. Actually, sort of a role model for our project is Eric Edelman, who's also one of our board members. But I first met him in 2007, and he was working on Iraq, and they had an idea that they were thinking of, and it bore some relation to what was going on in Vietnam. And so they brought me into the Pentagon for an hour to talk to him and some other senior officials. And I think it had some value to them, and obviously I couldn't give them all the answers, but I think having that historical perspective was value. And again, it's very easy to get caught up in the crisis of the day, that it's valuable that way. Also, you talked about complexity. I think that's one of the advantages of history and historians. I think the social sciences, in many respects, and not all of them, but many of them oversimplify things, especially when they try to quantify things or come up with grand theories. And history makes you understand how complex things are, that things are nonlinear, that you actually need to spend a lot of time studying something before you can really understand it. You also raised the point about interdisciplinary work, and we do actually support things that are beyond pure history. I've actually written a couple books that are sort of in the political science realm. But we do encourage historians to do comparative history, where you're taking a subject. Hal Brand's book, someone mentioned a good example. You maybe take the 5 different administrations, look at their history for trends in certain areas. speaking of interdisciplinary, another thing that came to mind, I recently read a book called Super Forecasting. Has anyone here read that book?
It's on my list. I'm not reading.
So it's a pretty interesting book. The book looks at forecasting I mean, it grew out of an earlier work that found basically the experts you see on TV don't really predict things any better than anyone else. They just say things better. And so then they did this study to try to figure out if there's actually anyone who can predict these things. And they actually found this group of super forecasters who are in general better if you give them a question like, is Ukraine going to lose another 100 square kilometers of territory in the next 6 months, yes or no? And so they answer stuff like this over a long period of time. And one of the most interesting things they found was that after about 5 years, the super forecasters were no better than anyone else. And so it raises this question of how can we really think about the future if we're, in history, I think it indicates how often we get the future wrong. So how do we think about that? So I was going to ask you a question. You talked a little bit about futurism, but maybe if you could talk a little more how your historical sense, your historical knowledge makes you think about future, because you obviously in your position can't just say we don't know anything, but so how do you think through that?
Okay, so thank you. So I think the first way that we think through it is we acknowledge the continuities in the nature of war, and these are the continuities that make wars. Sir Michael Howard observed. They make wars resemble each other more than they resemble any other human activity. And so if you acknowledge what makes war different, which is it's waged for political outcomes, its political nature, it's the human drivers of conflict, the interactive nature of war. War is a contest of wills, for example. It helps you resist sort of simplistic analogies, like some of those in the 1990s. I mean, some of them had to do with Moore's law and computing power equals fundamental change in war, for example. So it helps you understand continuities. But then, of course, the character of war is always evolving and changing. And so what we do is we really look at four key elements. We look through this four key considerations as we look to future armed conflict. The first is, as I mentioned already, threats, enemies, and adversaries in the future operating environment. And this is to make a grounded projection into the near future, to see emerging threats to national security. And, we don't have to be super imaginative these days, unfortunately. And so we're concerned, obviously, with the two revisionist powers on the Eurasian landmass, Russia and China, who are, I think, engaged in what you might say a form of limited war for an objective of collapsing the post-World War II political, economic, and security order, and to replace that order with one that is more sympathetic to their interests. They are pursuing a very sophisticated strategy that combines the use of unconventional forces under the cover of conventional forces, but also involves a very sophisticated propaganda disinformation campaign, economic actions, and political subversion, and so forth. So this is one threat set to look at, and both of those militaries are modernizing their militaries. And Russia in particular has been aggressive in the use of its militaries in the invasion of Ukraine, in Syria, and so forth. So we're watching that very carefully. We're looking at Russian capabilities and emerging capabilities to do a vulnerability analysis on us to see where our capability gaps are, but also to understand better what our strengths are relative to them so we can preserve and accentuate those strengths. So the threats, enemies, and adversaries in future operating environments. I think we obviously look very closely at North Korea. I think it's difficult to overstate the threat from North Korea. Iran, who I think you can argue has been waging a proxy war against us since 1979, and then this terrorist proto-state in the greater Middle East is representative of terrorist organizations that are striving to gain control of territory, populations, and resources. And so what we're trying to do then is we look at these and say, okay, look at each of these problem sets on their own terms, but also recognize, that these problems are completely disconnected from each other, right? Our adversaries and enemies will continuously, sort of calculate their actions and pay attention to where they might see opportunities associated with the effect that others are having on us and our interests. But what is common across all of these conflicts that we see, or potential conflicts, is they're fundamentally about the control of territory, populations, and resources. What also we see common across these is that our potential enemies take they do four things that are common. The first thing they try to evade what they see as our strengths. We have to understand that our enemies are not going to be the passive recipients of our military prowess, right? They'll engage in counteractions, traditional simple ones: dispersion, concealment, intermingling with civilian populations. They'll disrupt our capabilities. They'll come after what they see as our network strike capability, for example, with sophisticated cyber and electronic warfare capabilities as Russia's build up. They're concerned about our air power. So Russia has established air supremacy over Ukraine from the ground. And so, these are the kinds of things that are common, though, across different adversaries and enemies. The third is that those enemies will emulate our capabilities and adversaries. I mean, China has engaged in the greatest theft of intellectual property in history, and it is our technological advantage that's probably most transferable to our enemies. And then finally, our adversaries will expand onto other battlegrounds of propaganda, disinformation, political subversion, criminality, and so forth. So threats, the second are what kind of missions we think we would have to conduct in the future to secure our interests. That comes a lot from strategic guidance. The third is technology, changes in technology, but also understanding, from a historical perspective, there's always countermeasures, right? So, there's the submarine, sonar, bomber, radar, machine gun, tank, anti-tank missile. And so understanding that interaction within technology, enemy technologies, our technologies that we're developing to gain an advantage. And then finally, history and lessons learned is the fourth explicit lens that we look at. And we can learn so much, obviously, from what's going on today in conflicts we are still involved in. I was thinking whenever I hear this, wow, what is it like to be in this post-war period? I'm like, man, what post-war period are you talking about? We're learning a lot from conflicts we're in, but also other conflicts like French operations in Mali during Serval, or Israeli combat operations in Gaza or southern Lebanon in 2006. And so learning from what's going on that we see around the world today is important. Ukraine obviously is, and Russian operations in Syria are things we're paying particular attention to. So that's how we think. That's the framework we think through. And then what we try to do then is lay a strong conceptual foundation based on that thinking for Army modernization. And so based on that understanding of future armed conflict, then we describe how Army forces in the future will have to be prepared to fight how they would fight to secure our nation and our vital interests as part of a joint force with multinational partners, with civilian agencies and others. So that's a description of how we have to fight in the future. That's in the highly readable Army operating concept. It's just in time for you to take to the ski slopes with you. There's a whole family of concepts associated with that conceptual foundation, and the latest is in draft form called multi-domain battle. Then based on that foundation, that conceptual foundation, we have to identify what are the required capabilities of that future force. And then we learn. We learn through seminars, experimentation, wargaming, and we learn through a framework called the Warfighting Challenges. These are 21st order questions, the answers to which will inform future force development. And so it's an effort to learn in a focused, sustained, and collaborative manner, not to learn repetitively or episodically. In the Army, we get enthusiastic about things, so it's like, hey, what about robots, man? Everybody goes after robots. So if it's worth doing, it's worth overdoing, right, in the Army. But then the problem is then we'll forget about that and we'll go on to something else. It's like, kids soccer, right? So counter UAS. The key is we have to learn under this framework in a sustained manner, and then obviously we have to analyze what we're learning effectively and then bridge into implementation. And I think there's a role for history in each of these phases, right? So, what do we read? Well, we're reading history to understand better contemporary conflicts and the threats. We're reading the history of technology, right, and interactions between technology and organizations and doctrine and so forth. So Williamson Murray's work is seminal in this area. The book, The Dynamics of Military Revolution, he did with McGregor Knox in 2001 is tremendously helpful to us still. And the book, Military Innovation, Interwar Period, a lot of great literature out there on technology. A lot of literature on militaries that did innovate effectively and learned effectively, and those that didn't. Bob Doty's work on comparing and contrasting the French and the Germans in the interwar period. Jenny Kiesling's work. So I could go on and on about history and as it applies to each of these. Even the history of how we got weapon systems, the king of the killing fields, and the development of the M1 tank, and So everything we do, we have Wayne Lee from University of North Carolina coming to our organization tomorrow to talk about history and the history of waging war and how to think about changes in the character of warfare. So that's just that's not a very quick, synopsis. But
Well, I'll ask you one more question, then we'll open up to the audience. One of the first historians we had about 2 months ago was Brian Lynn, who's got a new book out called Elvis's Army, which for those history buffs, I'd recommend reading it. But in the book, he looks at the Army in the 50s and makes the point that a lot of the transformation that we hear now, and the third offset and all these things, are actually very similar to what was being said in the 1950s, and that they ran into a problem ultimately that the technology they wanted to introduce surpassed the capabilities of the military because you did not have sufficiently educated workforce within the military. And there's certainly lots of talk these days about personnel, and especially trying to find innovative personnel. Where would you say the Army is right now in terms of human resources, and what further steps would you advise the Army to make?
Okay, so this is a big area of focus for us, and we say in the Army operating concept in Appendix C, it's awesome. Wait till you get to that. You'll be like, what's going to happen next, right? So in Appendix C, we say that our differential advantage comes from combinations of resilient, well-trained soldiers and cohesive teams and adaptive leaders with technology. That's our differential advantage. And so we are at pains every day to say, hey, we don't man equipment, we equip the man or woman, and so the key thing for us, I think, is from the very beginning to ensure that we are cognizant of how that technology actually applies to the problem of war and warfare. I think the warfighting challenges help us do that. And then that we also understand how to integrate that capability into an organization that's going to apply it. And so we have a very rigorous experimentation program where we get capabilities in the hands of soldiers very early. And this is, like, for example, the Army Expeditionary Warfighting Experiment at Fort Benning, or there's one called the Maneuver and Fires Integration Experiment at Fort Sill. There's a cyber equivalent that we do in New Jersey. So I think that getting that equipment in then allows soldiers to see how they would apply it, and then it gives feedback to industry and it informs our requirements. So, for example, we're about to buy and field a unmanned aerial system that's about this big, that fits in a soldier's pocket, and has a significant amount of range, so that before you cross the street in an urban area, or before you cross a danger area where an enemy machine gun might be covering, you can send this soldier-borne sensor out, and you have a real-time downlink from the sensor. Now, the tactics for employing that, where it could be distributed, and then also some of the design changes came from early experimentation. So, for example, it wasn't very good in the wind, so I got to fly to Fort Benning a few years ago. It went up and it kind of blew right back against the wall, That's fixed now. And so I think that getting the technology in and seeing how it applies helps. The second thing is to try to simplify things. And there's a great book called Men, Machines, in Modern Times, written by Elting Morrison in the 1960s. And in the book, he said that man has succeeded in creating these machines to help tame his natural environment, but in doing so has created an artificial environment that is far more complex than the natural environment ever was, right? So I think, can we get to the point, we stress getting to the point where we're integrating technology that actually simplify things for soldiers. I mean, everybody uses the iPhone as the example of that, right? I mean, it's intuitive, it's easy to use. So we're trying to evolve a lot of our systems in that direction as well. And then, of course, it's training and education and bringing in the best soldiers we can, the best men and women in our society. I think that there is an untapped desire to serve in our country. And so what I would like to see is more young men and women volunteering to serve, increasing the pool of candidates so we can become even more selective. And we are pretty selective already in terms of who comes into our Army and our armed forces. And then I think we have to do a better job in attracting them by communicating the rewards of service, which are less tangible and less visible than the sacrifices, right? And the difficulties of service. Long separations, hardships, obviously the physical risk, the loss of comrades, and so forth. But those rewards are, being part of something bigger than yourself, being part of a team in which the man or woman next to you is willing to give everything, including their own life for you. Where else do you have that kind of a, rewarding experience in an organization that really takes on the quality of a family, and then I think that we have to stress more that our soldiers are warriors, but they're also humanitarians, and they're humanitarians because we are confronting the enemies of all civilized people, with these groups like Daesh or Al Qaeda, but they're humanitarians because they are actually taking action to protect innocence from this kind of brutality, so I think that we could do a better job at attracting more in. Brian Lynn cites it in the book. There's a 1958 Look magazine article, right? I think it's 1958, and the great historian Jonathan Shai is featured in the article as an Army captain who's leaving, and so the theme is like you're bleeding talent and everything. I mean, so you could have just changed the names and the date, and you think you're writing about today, right? The equipment's being more complex and everything. So it's not a new challenge, but it's certainly a challenge, and I think we're emphasizing this across really all of our activities.
Great. Well, we've got about 15 minutes for questions, so we'll start with the gentleman right here.
Thank you. Henry Newseum, Secor Holdings, and Tar Heel native. The first offset seemed to be a reaction to stalemate in Vietnam. In Korea. The second to defeat in Vietnam, and the third seems to be, in part, whether reaction or not, they come in the wake of these conflicts, and the third to purgatory in Iraq and Afghanistan. To what extent are these bureaucratic responses that provide a refuge, and often a technological refuge, that isn't exactly relevant to the sources of our recent failures?
Yeah, it's a great question, and that's a real danger, So I think that many of us are cognizant of that danger, that this could be like some kind of a cathartic, hey, wow, man, that war was really hard. Let's go on to like a really cool war that'll be a lot more fun, right? Or something that a problem that can be solved quickly and so forth. So I think that we're very cognizant of that, and so we are engaging, for example, in a study on Russian new generation warfare, but that's just doing what you expect the Army to do, right? Pay attention to what you're learning. But we're not saying that, hey, that's what all warfare is going to be. We're also taking a hard look at other threat capabilities and obviously our ongoing operations and efforts in Afghanistan and Iraq. Conrad Crane has said it really well. The historian Conrad Crane said, there are two ways to fight the U.S. military: asymmetrically and stupid, right? And you hope that the enemy picks stupid, but they're unlikely to do so. So I think that we have to be prepared to fight across a range of contingency operations. We've never been able to predict, with any degree of certainty, what the next conflict is going to be. And then we have to just do what Sir Michael Howard said: not be so far off the mark that we can't adjust once the real demands of a conflict reveal themselves to you. So we're emphasizing real adaptability, the ability to adapt quickly to circumstances, to learn quickly, develop situational understanding in contact with these complex problem sets. And I think one of the things we have to really do is recognize that, hey, there are no short-term solutions to long-term problems. And if we try to take a short-term approach to a long-term problem, we're just guaranteeing that we're going to extend the duration of our effort and probably just increase the scale of it. So we are really emphasizing in the Army the consolidation of military gains is an integral part of war and warfare. It's not an optional part, and so I don't think we're trying to simplify things in some sort of effort to get beyond Iraq or Afghanistan into a much better kind of war, but that is definitely a danger. And I think, across the Joint Force and in some of the defense intellectual community, there was a tendency toward that. If you go back to like the early work on air-sea battle, I think it's much better now. It's multi-domain battle. I think we're on the right path now. But there was really a tendency to say, well, those wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, they were aberrational. Let's get back to really what we do best. And I would recommend Hal Brand's and Peter Fever's response to the Mearsheimer offshore balancing argument in this issue of foreign affairs. It's really, really good. And I think it's something we all have to, probably try to get out there, get that argument out there, to inoculate us against that simplistic thinking.
Sure, in the black leather jacket here.
Thank you. My name is Keith Hill. I'm with Bloomberg BNA, but I'm here as a private citizen. And I'd like to approach your answer to not the last question, but the question before that from a different direction. I heard the Army Chief of Staff mention the fact that the Army is the only branch of the service where more than 50% of its manpower comes from the Guard and Reserves. In addition to the fact, well, actually, that was done because, General Abrams, when he was Army Chief of Staff, he wanted a situation where when the Army went to war, it was going to be America going to war rather than just the Army going to war. Now, in addition to a lack of knowledge about history, would you say that a more fundamental problem is the fact that there's this disconnect between the average American and the military?
Yeah. Well, I think there's a big problem, and I think the problem is getting worse probably just because of the size of the Army the Army getting smaller, and so those touch points being fewer. And then fewer and fewer families having a direct stake, in it because they've got, sons or daughters, brothers and sisters in the service. The Guard and Reserve is a critical bridge between, I think, our military and our citizens. And I think that the more we can create opportunities, identify opportunities to a broader population to serve, the better. I think there are a number of initiatives we could undertake to do that. I think one is, an idea, is that we could have multi-component contracts for recruiters. So, for example, I think we should do more of those. So if you're coming out of high school and you don't want to defer college or a job for another civilian job that you want maybe for more than 2 years, maybe come in for a 2-year active duty enlistment and then have a 3-year or 4-year National Guard commitment on the back end. Then you serve back in your home state. There's some great incentives, associated with the National Guard service in terms of tuition relief and that sort of thing. So I think there's a lot more we can do. The other thing I think is just engaging more broadly in our communities. I mean, I think that military leaders, our sergeants and our officers in particular, ought to get out in their communities as much as they can and make the posts as accessible as possible. I mean, I had the privilege of commanding Fort Benning, Georgia, and there is not a better event than a basic training graduation. I mean, it's unbelievable, man. I mean, you'll laugh, you'll cry, way better than Cats, almost as good as Hamilton, maybe. I don't know. So, but I mean, it's amazing. So I think making it more accessible. But any ideas you have, sir? I'm easy to track down through these guys, or I give you any suggestions anybody has on how to connect better? We're all for it. Thanks.
All right, man in front.
Hi, General McMaster. Courtney McBride with Inside the Army. Kind of a two-part question for you. You've spoken, and some of the other Army senior leaders have spoken about the fact that this is the first time, perhaps since World War I, that the Army hasn't had a new combat vehicle under development.
Right.
And you've spoken about the personnel issues. Can you frame for us the broader situation the Army finds itself in a historical context? And then also, how does recent Army history, sort of the specter of FCS and other things, impact your efforts to develop future capabilities for the Army? Is there a concern that budget drives capabilities development as opposed to strategy?
Yeah, well, that's great questions. The Army. Remember the old book by Carl Bilder called Massive Command? It was about different cultures and different services. It's changed. It's a little bit dated now because it was before the all-volunteer force and everything. But I think you got the Army really right. The Army's culture is a servant of the nation, and we tend to be, we tend to have like a streak of asceticism in us. I think the Marine Corps might be the same way in this connection. Well, we can make do with what we've got and everything else, and so sometimes that prevents us from making a very clear argument for, I think, the capabilities we need for the future. So I think in terms of Army modernization, combat vehicles is an example of really a bow wave of deferred Army modernization. And so I think that there are a number of good reports on this, but I think the CSIS report from about 6 months ago is particularly good, in which the author talks about the triple whammy of Army modernization capability and capacity. And the triple whammy is that the Army size of the Army has been severely reduced from 570,000 active to 450 active, 1.1 total force, 1.1 million total force. That is a huge reduction, way below the 482,000 that we had in the active Army prior to the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. And if you remember, the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq were breaking an active Army of 482,000. So we grew the Army to 570,000. At the peak of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, we had 170,000 soldiers deployed, 53,000 of whom were reserve component, National Guard and Army Reserve. So 123,000 active deployed in an Army of 570, and the Secretary of Defense at the time said, hey, we're still breaking the Army. So now when you go down to 450, just think about what forces you have to surge forward. And guess what? As Brian Lynn points out, the historical pattern is that after wars, your commitments go up to consolidate the gains. What are we seeing? Right? Well, the wars are still going on, first of all, in Afghanistan and Pakistan area, in the Middle East, where you have a rotational brigade now in Kuwait, in addition to the forces that are committed in support of Iraqi armed forces, Kurdish armed forces, Turkish armed forces, in Iraq, and then you have a rotational commitment to Korea, one to Europe now because of Russian aggression. So one is capacity in the Army. The second thing is that in previous periods of drawdowns, that the Army had recently been modernized. Well, we did a lot of really important things to strengthen our forces for Iraq and Afghanistan, but those were really niche capabilities for those particular fights that are not really the modernization priorities we need to deter conflict and respond to crises in the future, especially against capable nation states. So there's that bow wave of deferred modernization, and it's compounded by a very significant reduction in the modernization budget. So what do? Well, hey, in a democracy, you get the Army the American people are willing to pay for, right? And it's our job to do the best you can with what you've got. So we are working very hard to not do what you said is the danger, which is to have the means, the money you have, determine what you do instead of having the objectives drive it, right? So the tendency has been, okay, as the budget gets cut, you spread less and less money over more and more programs, and you get less and less for your defense dollar as a result. So we're trying to ruthlessly prioritize, but we're also trying to make the case for investment in Army capabilities. Can you imagine if you went to the Navy and said, hey, are you guys working on any new ships? And they're like, no, we're good. We like the ships we have. To not be working on a combat vehicle when we see our friends and our potential enemies fielding more advanced capabilities. Now we're upgrading, as you know, the Bradley and the tank they're not the same Bradley and tank by any means from the 1980s, but they're from the 1980s. You know what I mean? And so there's only so much you can do. And now when you look at putting active protection, other network-related demands into those vehicles, layering in other protective capabilities, additional armor, new infrared radar, you just overburden the vehicle. So I do think we've got a significant and growing bow wave of deferred Army modernization.
Sir, over here.
Thank you for your time. My name is Drake Long. I'm a student at Miami University of Ohio. I'm here with the Alexander Hamilton Society. I want to ask you a question about military history. So to the average person, the subjects of military and diplomatic history might seem to have their strong points in terms of subject matter. For military history, maybe the Civil War. For diplomatic history, maybe World War I. In your opinion, when it comes to military history, what's a conflict, a diplomatic moment, or a war that you think not enough is written on and definitely needs to be more paid attention to, especially with regards to conflicts right now? Thank you.
Okay. Well, I think I would say that just going in recent history, I would say the Iraq War. And Joel Rayburn is here. Joel, want to raise your hand? It's a distinguished gentleman there, Colonel Joel Rayburn. He has just drafted a seminal operational history of the Iraq War, and I think what that's going to be is a tremendous jumping off point for historians to really dig into aspects of that operational history in greater depth. I think in large measure we've been distracted about Iraq by not the wrong question, but a question that we've asked and probably answered, which is, should we have done it, right? I think the great question to ask is, who the hell thought it would be easy, right? And why, right? And so, and then how did the war progress from that point on? So I think the Iraq War, and then obviously connecting it to what's going on today. I think Michael Gordon is working on probably another volume, and he's very good and been very good. I think that's the contemporary history, contemporaneously written histories that are really going to stand the test of time. His Cobra and Endgame books, and this next volume. What other conflicts need to be written more about? I think there's always, as my advisor at University of North Carolina, Dick Cohn said, he said, that don't think that there's too much written on a particular topic, right? So, because there's always another good book or a different approach you can take, or access to new materials. Heck, look at what Rick Atkinson did in World War II, right? We've written a lot about World War II, and so what he did is he took a historian's approach of doing multi-archival research, but also uncovering, through his investigative journalism background, papers that were still in people's attics, and they got all kinds of new materials. Look at Wick Murray's book on the Civil War that just came out, right? A lot has been written on the Civil War. Man, that book is brilliant in terms of not new materials, but a different analytical framework to understand the course of the war and the war's outcome. So I would say just do what you're drawn to, what you're interested in, and you'll find more than enough material for a good book.
All right, we have time for one last question. Sir in the back.
Rick Atkinson, by the way, is writing a trilogy on the Revolutionary War now. It's going to be awesome too, I think.
Sir, Steve Rodriguez, venture capitalist and also fellow at NDU, writing on venture capital type things, at least as they relate to, the kind of stuff that we're talking about here. This kind of piggybacks on the reporter's question up front around the, Army platforms. I remember, the Big Five.
Yeah.
Was it Blackhawk, Apache, Bradley, Abrams, and MLRS? I don't think it's a coincidence that we haven't really had a Big Five, and candidly, one of the Army's biggest acquisitions is buying a truck. So, congrats.
Come on now.
But
Right.
having been I was a part of Army After Next, Army Transformation, and I remember watching how those war games went down, right? And I'm sure you or at least are familiar with those. And
I wrote a very entertaining monograph on that. Not really entertaining. It's pretty dry, but it's called "Cracking the Foundation: Defense Transformation and the Underlying Assumption of Dominant Knowledge in Future War."
So it's probably about one of the scenarios I wrote. Well, the challenge I've noticed though is that whether we have 450 or 570 or pick your number, we don't really have a unifying threat like we did when we had when we came up with the Big Five, right? We knew exactly who we were fighting, and that made it really easy to say, hey, we need a main battle tank with a 120 millimeter gun and so on and so forth. Going forward, whether you want to talk about how many folks you need or how many platforms you need, the big challenge I've seen is what we used to call future operating environment. Maybe there's a new term of art for it, but basically, who the hell are we fighting? And given your role at Army Capabilities and Integration Center, I mean, how do you orient around that? How do you even approach building an army, when you're fighting the blob, right? Or fighting in vapor in this case? Thanks.
Well, I think we have really concrete problem sets now. So I think it's not a problem at all. I think we have an opportunity to really mature our defense planning scenarios based on concrete problems in Asia broadly, with a revisionist power there, in Northeast Asia with a unpredictable and armed to the teeth with some old conventional equipment, but now nuclear armed North Korea, with Russia and what Russia's demonstrated already with its capabilities, and I could go through those if you want. If we had more time, I could. Other scenarios as well. So we have very, I think, well-developed scenarios as a basis for our wargaming and our experimentation. And what those war games and experimentation is allowing us to do is establish a very clean logic trail between the future operating environment, the problem of future armed conflict, basically, the scenarios associated with that, how the Army has to fight as part of the joint multinational team to protect the nation against those threats, enemies, and adversaries in that operating environment, the capabilities required of that force, then through our learning, identification of the capability gaps and opportunities to maintain overmatch, integrated solutions, which are doctrine, organization, training, leader development, material solutions, all integrated, and then specific requirements. So what is like an equivalent of the Big Five today? Well, these are really capability areas that we think are immensely important for the future fight. I mentioned combat vehicles. All the trends that we see in future war are making close combat more, not less likely. In fact, long-range capabilities are those that are in jeopardy, right? Satellite-based communications, precision navigation and timing. The whole network strike capability is we're going to work out countermeasures, but the enemy has ways to counter that now. They've potential enemies do, and they've focused on it. So what are the trends that we see that are that we have to cope with? All domains will be contested. In the 90s, everything was dominance, this and that, full spectrum dominance. It was ridiculous. And it was never going to happen anyway, but I think now everybody's convinced, okay, all domains will be contested. We will not have air or maritime or cyber electromagnetic supremacy. We're going to have to fight for superiority, and that superiority will probably be temporary windows of superiority across those domains. The second thing is that the battlefield is increasingly lethal in terms of range of weapon systems, but also energetics and sort of the democratization of destruction, right? With even networked smaller forces having greater destructive power and capabilities. The third is complex battlefields, the need to fight in and among populations and likely in urban areas as well. And the fourth is that all operations will be degraded. So we can't develop like exquisite systems that fail catastrophically. We need redundancy, and we need systems that degrade gracefully. So what does that mean for us in terms of capabilities? I mentioned combat vehicles. Combat vehicles is tied to a larger problem set of advanced protection. That means area protection and also protection on specific combat vehicles and aircraft. The so-called Russian snow dome capability. Russia's established air supremacy over Ukraine from the ground. Right, so we need tiered air defense capabilities, electronic warfare capabilities that allow us to protect our forces and so forth. A third area of emphasis for us is robotic and autonomy enabled systems, which I think can do really 5 big things for us. If you Google the robotic and autonomous system strategy, we have a strategy out on that, and I think we have a pretty good way ahead on that. The fourth area is cross-domain fires. And this is the ability for Army forces to be able to project power outward from land into the maritime, aerospace, and cyber electromagnetic domains. And so we are already developing capabilities now that have tremendous promise using even existing systems that will give us the ability to sink ships, to be able to, if you have a fires unit, it can do surface to surface, surface to air, or shore to ship. Other critical capabilities involve future vertical lift, I think a very good program going now that will give us a lot more speed, payload, and legs, so we can self-deploy, and you can bypass so-called A2AD bubbles and employ forces into areas where they can then maneuver from offset objective areas. And then all of this is underpinned by soldier and team performance and overmatch. As I mentioned, close combat is getting more and more effective. It was kind of a dramatic op-ed, by General Scales, who I love yesterday, which in the Wall Street Journal, where he said, hey, we need to invest more. I agree with him in close combat capabilities, but we're doing quite a bit there. I mentioned soldier-borne sensor. We're also developing a flying munition called a LMAM. It's extremely effective. We're also developing counter-defilade shoulder-fired capability. We have developed the first shoulder-fired weapon that has a ballistic solution. It has an integrated thermal sight, a laser rangefinder, and it ends firefights. So if anybody's read The Outpost by Jake Tapper, if you haven't read it, I recommend it. You think we don't want to put our soldiers in that kind of a situation where, where a Taliban platoon with a sack of RPGs can pin down, a U.S. infantry unit. So we're developing those overmatch capabilities and getting them into the field pretty quickly. So I don't think there's a lack of clarity at all. And we are drafting now a future force development strategy that would help us communicate this outside the Army better. But if you go to the Army Capabilities website, our website, you see this. This is what TRADOC has put out as the big 6+1 capabilities that are tied in that logic trail all the way back to how we have to fight in the future and the future operating environment.
Well, HR, it's been a tremendous pleasure listening to you. Thanks so much for coming and spending some of your very busy day with us. Everyone could join me in a round of applause for HR.
And on that happy note, I again thank you, Mark. Thank you, General McMaster. I thank all of you for joining us today and wish you all best for the rest of the year and a happy 2017. Thank you for coming to the FPI Forum.